Okay, all right. Well, good evening, everybody. Yeah, thank you. It's good to see everybody. This session is going to be on, the range of interventions with fellowships from diversity frameworks to anti-racist. And we're just going to start off with this work with the Minnesota Orchestra, with each introducing ourselves. So I'll start. I'm Justin Laing, and I work with Hillombo, a consulting company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, focusing on anti-racist and frameworks in facilitation, in some work around conflict resolution, and a lot of work on helping people create experiments. So we're going to be kind of in one of those today, and looking forward to the conversation.
Hello, I'm Beth Kellar-Long. I'm the Vice President of Orchestra Administration at the Minnesota Orchestra, and I've been there for over 30 years in various roles, and over the past about 4 years, I've been the staff lead for our DEI and anti-racism work. And I was going to share that I first met Justin actually at a SphinxConnect conference in 2018, and it was at a reception talking about fellowships. So it's kind of interesting that here we are now in a session discussing fellowships. So really happy to be here with all of you and to have this conversation.
Hey everyone, my name is Lovrick Gary, and I'm currently the bass trombone fellow with the Minnesota Orchestra. This is my second season with the orchestra.
So I thought I'd start by just giving you a little bit of a background here about the Minnesota Orchestra, how we got to this point here of having this conversation with you all tonight. So in October of 2021, after working with Justin for doing some work on anti-racist learning projects and what Justin calls experiments, we got to the point where the DEI committee had recommended to the board some guiding principles for anti-racist decision making. And the board adopted those in October of 21. And those are, the first one is to disrupt the Minnesota Orchestra's role in systemic racism by recognizing and challenging white privilege and centering the voices of Amelia people, both internally and externally. And Amelia is a term that we use for African, Middle Eastern, Latin, Indigenous, Asian. The second principle is to build mutually beneficial partnerships with Amelia individuals, organizations, and communities by listening first. And the third principle is to use anti-racist thinking frames, for example, a justice frame, rather than racist thinking frames, for example, a charity frame. So, really wonderful to get to that point of adopting those principles. And then the next thing is, okay, so what does that mean? And how do you operationalize those? How do you incorporate that into your work? And so that was the next thing we started working on. Like, what is the process for that? And so we've been working with Justin on that, and he's been meeting with the senior staff. One of the things is to meet monthly with the senior staff, specifically on that. And as we were meeting, we had, there was a media story, an interview with our two fellows, and this story came out. And there were some things about the story that just didn't feel good. I think from the orchestra's perspective and also from the fellows' perspectives. It very much was positioned as a charity frame, and there were some things about the interview experience that really didn't feel good to the fellows. And so as we were talking about that as a senior staff, it became apparent that this was a situation where we needed to apply our anti-racist guiding principles. I mean, there's so many situations where you need to apply your guiding principles, and this was one of them. So we started thinking about, okay, how might we do that? How might we look at the fellowship, apply those guiding principles? And so we're going to talk about that tonight. And in the course of that, we asked Garrett McQueen if he would do a facilitate a group interview with our past and present fellows. That happened just before Christmas. And Justin has been analyzing the data from that. Justin sat in on that fellowship interview. He's been analyzing that. We've just started talking about all of that. So this is like, we're in process of this. You guys are all in the process with us. So we're going to be talking about it with you. We're going to be really interested to hear in the Q&A what you're thinking as we talk about it. And so it's really in progress right now. So I'll turn it over to you now, Justin.
All right, so let's just start with Lovrick. So obviously you're currently a fellow, right? And, you know, there's been conversations about, you know, the charity frame, some of those challenges. And of course, though, you wouldn't do this if there wasn't some clear upside. So I wonder if you might just speak about both some of the challenges, but then also, you know, any upsides that you feel like, you know, need to be shared as a part of that.
Sure. So I think fellowships in general, I think when you, like, if you just look at the framework of a fellowship, any orchestra, you know, you go on their website and you look and you see, like, okay, the fellow will receive coachings and get lessons and, you know, do mock auditions, but also play with the orchestra and potentially participate in, you know, outreach things. I think that frame alone kind of like creates a level of complexity in what your role is. And so I think, and I think it has the potential, you know, once you're there to kind of create challenges for the fellow, you know, while you're there. Because, you know, if you're basically being put, you know, sort of in like the student frame, you know, like where you're going to receive weekly lessons and be coached and that kind of thing, but also you're going to get paid and you're going to play with members of the orchestra, you know, it's kind of weird because then once you get there, people wonder like, okay, how do I treat this person? You know, how am I to treat this person? Do I treat them as just a regular member of the orchestra, or, you know, am I now like their teacher? So, and then it puts them in a weird situation. And I think there could be a range of different, you know, ways that ends up playing out. But I think just that framing alone just kind of creates potential for there to be, you know, just weird little things along the way. But as an upside, as Justin mentioned, you know, you are receiving these things. Like, these aren't negatives necessarily, receiving coachings and mock auditions. There's nothing negative about that. Because, you know, as all of us looking to apply for a fellowship, that's part of, you know, what we're intrigued by, you know, playing with the orchestra and getting lessons from, you know, whoever your favorite player may be, you know. But I think the framework is what can pose a potential risk to the fellow.
Yeah. And I think that's what is meant by the idea of a charity framework, right? This idea that, like, you know, here we are, the orchestra, bestowing these things around against to people who are Black, or Latin American, and then it's, you know, of course, the white organization doing that. So Beth, as the person who's managing this overall project, and what do you see as the challenges in trying to even manage it? And then same question, but also what are the kind of benefits?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so the benefits, well, certainly the goal is for the fellows to win jobs, to win tenure track jobs. And we've had, counting the fellows that we have right now, we've had 6 fellows. 3 of them have tenure track jobs right now, so I think that's great. So that is definitely a benefit, something really great. The challenges, that charity frame, you know, how to get this to a justice frame. How do you? We are wrestling with that, you know, and looking at how do we name the benefits that the orchestra is receiving, and how do we talk about that, you know? white people have so much discomfort in talking about race, you know, and so even as we're having those conversations with the senior staff, I mean, you're there.
Yeah.
For a lot of them, that's hard for the senior staff to do. So there is a discomfort organizationally in talking about race and racialization, and to name that for the organization. People in the organization, of course, are at different places in terms of their support for our anti-racist work, so that's a challenge. And, you know, I was thinking about the study that the League put out, the 40 years of fellowship. I think that came out in 2016, and I studied that, and we took so many of those learnings into account when we were putting together our fellowship. And I was just looking back through it, and I thought, you know, so many of those challenges are still the same challenges, and of course it's not that long ago since it was put together, but those challenges are still there. There's, of course, the challenge of loyalty to local subs, you know, on the part of the musicians in the orchestra. So anyway, those are some of the things. And of course, then there's the things that we were thinking about in terms of the reframing, which we can get to later. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of reframing, one of the things I appreciated that Garrett brought to the discussion was, you know, kind of this meta framework that orchestras are developed at the same time as imperialism, as colonialism, and they have that same basic message around classicality. It's basically a little microcosm of the dominant message of European imperialism, and then it sits there in this little kind of small subframe of the orchestra, in that it's the, you know, it's got the best property in the city, it's got the highest paid artists in most cases, and so, you know, one of the things we've talked about in our conversation is that, you know, without a change to the big meta frame there, right, it's hard to imagine how the frame of the fellowship can change, but so much, right? And or even if you had the fellowship be something like, this is out of some framework of reparations or something to that effect, that would be changing at a very higher level of the fellowship. But if you don't have that, I wonder, Lovrick, what do you see as changes that can be made, acknowledging, well, there's a big meta frame here that would need to change in order for it to be a totally shift. But if that doesn't happen, what kind of changes would you make to rules or smaller changes to it that you think could be done that would at least improve the experience of a fellow?
Yeah, so back to sort of like the structure of the fellowship. I think that, but, you know, me mentioning earlier, you know, sort of the fellow having to navigate the potential complexity of that structure. I think to alleviate some of that and sort of give the fellow a clear direction, like, this is my role here. But I think to also give the people within the organization, you know, like, okay, this is their role here. So, you know, even something as simple as having, you know, your contract laid out, like, this is what you're gonna do, this is what you're responsible for, X amount of weeks, or, you know, whatever, X amount of subscription weeks and X amount of other weeks, or whatever. I think even something as simple as that would alleviate some of those things, and like, you know, the you know, the subs, you know, the local musicians in whatever city you're in, kind of, you know, just that sort of thing. You kind of get rid of that, you know, because they still need work, but you shouldn't, it should be clear what your position is within the orchestra, so that no one feels like either of their toes are getting stepped on, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, one of the things that we talked about was, okay, so we have changes that are more technical, like that one, right? But then there could be more anti-racist ones. So the ones that you're describing, for me, feel like inclusion. Like, if you're going to want people to feel included, give them the dates they're going to play. Make sure that if they're going to have every opportunity to play, and if there's someone who's going to replace them like a sub, not replace them, but play instead of them like a sub or whatever, make sure that's clearly communicated. All those kind of things would at least be inclusion. We also talked about some shifts that could be considered more anti-racist, and the organization is looking at like moving from a diversity and inclusion framework to an anti-racist framework. And I wonder, Beth, if you might just kind of talk about how you see what potentially deeper changes could be, what that might be like to try to implement that. Just any thoughts you have about that.
Yeah, so that's the challenge, of course, and that's what we're in the midst of discussing, obviously, and trying to determine. And as you know, as Justin put together this analysis of the data and brought together put forward some recommendations. They kind of went on a range from this inclusion to, well, what we sort of analyzed later as inclusion to anti-racism. And so when I looked at them at first, I was saying, well, what you're talking about, Lovrick, like, I don't even, in a way, I didn't even see that as on that range. It's like, well, that would make the fellowship better, And then how are we getting to that point of anti-racism? And we were talking about, what might be a restorative kind of HR type thing. How might we look at, like, what is the relationship with as you were talking about, the local subs, what is the agreement there? How might we talk about that? How might we think about that? Discussions with our musicians. I think they're really tough questions. So those are some of the things along that range, and we definitely haven't settled on anything yet, because as we say, you're just in the point of analyzing, and we're just in these conversations right now. But those are towards that anti-racist side of the continuum. What might be restorative.
Right, in terms of maybe even stronger commitments to say, for example, one idea would be like, well, maybe we can get to that in a moment, but I guess I'm wondering about the idea of the subs, or the idea of the, or someone being given a 1 year while a fellow is there. That came up in the conversation with the fellows, and I wonder if either one of you might want to talk about even what that tension point is for somebody maybe who's thinking about getting a fellowship. What is that potential relationship between a fellow and the local musicians? Either one of you.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it just all depends, really. But I will before I will go back to that relationship there. What it would almost feel like or seem is that you don't necessarily have a specific role. If there is gonna be a 1 year or whatever, someone kind of fulfilling that duty that you're kind of doing already. But in terms of the personal relationship between you and the members, or
well, I guess just it came up, and it seemed it was a bit of a pain point, right? In the conversation, right? That I'm here, I can play, but a person who's playing the instrument I'm playing has been brought in as a sub for a certain piece, right? Or they've been given a 1 year, and now my opportunities are still scattered, right? And just, I guess I bring it up because Beth was referencing it, but I'm not sure whether or not it's clear what the issue was, and if you wanted to add anything to that about kind of your opinion about it.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it would just sort of amplify those things that I was talking about earlier. What your position is, what your role is. I think it would just make it that much more clear to the fellow, kind of what you already think is, or whatever you feel already may be the case, because you're kind of walking this thing where it's a fellowship, you're here because whatever, and I think it just sort of amplifies that in your mind already.
I think it gets to that phrase, redistribution of resources. There's subs who live in, for example, the Twin Cities, who have, who expect to get a certain amount of work, and there's a concern about that, the loyalty of those subs, about the livelihood of the subs, and frankly, for the Minnesota Orchestra, who had a 14-month lockout where the subs were extremely loyal to our musicians, that's a part of it as well. And so all of these things, of course, are extremely tricky, and so for the fellows, they're wanting to, of course, get as many opportunities to play as possible. And for the musicians in the orchestra who are making decisions about when people play, they're wanting to also, have the subs come in and play. So this is one example of the trickiness.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that be interesting to hear what other folks think about it is, and we talked about a little bit even about starting with the fellowships, even with some of these conversations, because of course the fellows probably have the least power in the overall organization, and it would feel very typical of how race works, that the folks who have the least power end up being the first ones out on some kind of big conversation. So that really won't work. But one of the initial thoughts I was thinking about was that, well, if you had a restorative HR position and you said, this is, one, we get benefits from the racialization of the fellows because we use them in images on the website. They can be, they tell a narrative of us, it tells a story of who we are, all those things. But the other question, I guess, was, well, what would it be like if there was a statement that said, going to that meta frame, well, the orchestra, the larger role that the Western canon, et cetera, has played, and we are going to give positions that are clearly marketed for those, because we know there's musicians out there who are clearly qualified. We're going to take that audition away and just put these seats out there. But the thing that we talked about was that might not make any difference. That might still, what came to me was like the Little Rock Nine. Like people are going to end up getting all the heat because it's going to be like, oh, that's how these positions were won in this whole culture of auditioning and that whole piece. And I know my brothers out here that folks have talked about this whole thing of auditions. So we're kind of, I wonder, if you all if you have a thought or two about that topic before we kick it open to the group.
Well, I think, and one thing we had sort of talked about too is we're doing this work under the Catalyst Fund, and I think the Catalyst Fund is interested in like what are their grantees finding and what are their recommendations, and I think we're finding one thing that would be interesting for the field and helpful for the field to explore is like what might restorative practices look like? What might restorative HR look like? And further delving into larger anti-racist changes. So I think the field has been really focused on inclusion. We've been talking about that, and that's something else that we're trying to delve into. Like going deeper into systemic, how have orchestras participated in systemic racism, not so much focused on inclusion. I think that's another area where the field could put some focus. And I know that at the midwinter managers meeting, actually that's happening maybe in 2 days or something, that they're going to be doing some conversations about that. I think they're meeting with representatives from the Black Orchestral Network and having some of these conversations, which I think is great.
Any thoughts before we kick it out? You're good? Okay, all right. Well, hopefully we have some questions, comments, ideas. Yeah.
I'm wondering if before you started your fellowship, or maybe even once after you started your fellowship, you did some groundwork to kind of create buy-in for a fellowship program, you know, but amongst the musicians, amongst your music director, among your board members, and what did that look like if you did it? And if you didn't do it, would you now, looking back on it, would you have done it, and what do you think it should include?
We did do some work on that. I think probably there's never enough work, and we are doing a lot of work. Actually, the work that we've been doing with Justin, one of our learning projects is about organization-wide anti-racist learning. But we did do work to create buy-in with the musicians. That was super important, and with the music director. And of course, there are different levels of. It is not evenly spread throughout the orchestra. Of course, you wouldn't expect everyone in a group of 85 or so people to all feel the same. And it has evolved over the time, but yeah, we definitely did that. And it was a collaborative process creating the fellowship. So there was a committee of musicians that we worked with really closely, who were really invested in creating the fellowship. So that was super important, and they were working with their colleagues on it as well.
You know, just one question I have about that just is, if you went back and thinking about this difference between diversity and anti-racism, would you think about maybe it'd be useful to have conversations, let's say orchestra-wide, around something that would say, this is at least to think about this notion of something that was restorative, or something, or some kind of conversation that would try to like warn people, let's not think about this in this charity way that will lead people to have these weird dynamics. Do you think that could even be done or thought about? And I wonder also, Lovrick, if you think what you would say you would want people to know in advance. But let's start with Beth, maybe.
Yeah, I think, if we were starting a fellowship program now, we would think about it very differently. I mean, we're in a very different place as an organization now, and just are beginning to understand about charity frameworks and justice frameworks. Yeah, we would approach it totally differently.
Yeah, you know, I think I'm probably going to repeat myself a bunch of times, but I really do think from the fellowship standpoint, being the fellow, I think that structure sort of sets up everything. And so, you know, just it being clear, I think that alone, like I said, it doesn't just speak to the fellow, but it speaks for the organization, to the organization too, I think. So
can I, a little bit, if you feel it's too much, but what would be the changes you would make to the frame? Like if you could say, I'd like to suggest these changes to someone who's thinking about it today, what would you offer? And some things come in that conversation that we had, but anything you think, yeah.
So I definitely start there, you know, for this, so that this person doesn't have to sort of walk the line of you know, so for instance, you know, like the 1 year, that sort of dynamic, where you maybe don't really feel like you're part of this thing. You're kind of an outsider, but also an insider at the same time. You know, to get rid of those, I think would start at the structure being, hey, this person, this is their role here, and this is what they're here to do. Just like any other person in the orchestra, you know, everyone has a pretty clear role on what their duty is. You know, if you're principal oboe, you know, your job is to sit in that chair and fulfill however many services or weeks, you know, as part of your contract. You're going to get paid this much, and this is why you're getting paid this much to do this. You know, it's very clear. You never have to walk into work and say, oh, well, like, what am I going to do today? You know, for any kind of job, that would create like a weird dynamic, you know, for the employer and the employee, you know, like to kind of have that sort of ambiguity of like what your role here is, you know. And so, yeah, I definitely start there. I kind of got lost in the sauce a little bit with my answer. Sorry.
That's good. Let's see if any other.
what did it feel like? I mean, in the sense of how were you welcomed or not welcomed? Did that evolve over time? It's like, how did you kind of get your footing once you got started?
Yeah. Well, firstly, it's really good to see you. Wow. Yeah, for me personally, saying all these things that I said already, I kind of had my own idea of what my experience would be like. But for me, when I got there, it was sort of the total opposite. And again, you never really know what to expect. But I felt like this real sense of warmth from the orchestra. And I play bass trombone, so I'm sitting back there in the low brass section, and all of those guys are great. And I don't feel like a student when I'm sitting back there. I just feel like a colleague when I'm working with them. So I think for me, I've been really lucky. But yeah.
Thank you. Hello. I was at that 2018 reception, so I speak as someone who has started a fellowship and made mistakes and learned and changed my thinking a lot. And when I think about frameworks, I mean, gosh, it's been such a brilliant conversation. The framework I started thinking about was scarcity, like orchestras exist in a scarcity mindset. I mean, that's the whole orchestra labor negotiations are all about fighting over crumbs. And I was thinking this whole issue of the subs, which is so fascinating to think about, is, and this is a half-formed thought, and I'm hoping you either push back or expand on this, but I was thinking so the construct of race is about creating white capital by pitting working class whites against working class blacks. And then it's so you divide there and you promise these working class whites that one day they'll get up to the top, but they won't. And then you just let the fighting happen down, or that's one version of the construct of race. And so here it's you're taking these working class, predominantly white musicians who are the subs, who don't have any security economically in their life, and then you're taking black musicians who are trying to make their way in, who also don't have security in their career and life, and it's you guys duke it out, but the orchestra, the field, the union, the administrators, whoever, isn't actually willing to expand the pie. They're just willing to let the fight happen down here and kind of just change how the crumbs are distributed. Is there something, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, that is something we've been thinking about. And actually, when I introduced myself and I said, for the past about 4 years, I've been the staff lead for our DEI and anti-racism work. Well, I'm super excited that we have Sherry Notaro, who's sitting right over there. Do you want to wave your hand? Who's our new VP of People and Culture and who is now leading our DEI and anti-racism work, and super excited to have her here. And she and I have been talking about some of that and what might be a way to look at that, because anyway, we've been talking about that. What might be some proposals we could make? What might be some things to help ease that, some investments maybe that we could make? I don't know if I'm quite ready to share any of the ideas yet, but we are thinking about that. And it's funny because I'm thinking back to that reception where Justin and I met, and I remember you came up to me and you said, funders and the idea of the scarcity, and either you get the money or you get it, and what if the pie were just bigger? So full circle here.
I don't remember that, but I'll take it. Yeah. First of all, Lovrick, do you ever thought about that? No, you're good? Okay. It's funny because I think another element of how, and for me, race is a euphemism for European supremacy. That's just a euphemism for that. When we say race, that's really what we're talking about, as a construct. And I think that another thing that comes up here is a certain kind of ways of European nationalism, white nationalism, and labor, and people of color relationship to unions. And so, what would it look like for, a question for me is, what kinds of negotiations could ever happen where those kinds of questions were addressed in the union, in the agreements, right? That it was like, we're an anti-racist union, and so we've got strategies about that. I also think that's why I think there's a larger frame that's needed for reparations, but what would it look like for an organization of white arts organizations to rally behind that, to think about that, right? So that you wouldn't have those things. So I guess I'll if you want to keep talking, like, what do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's fascinating. I mean, I think the idea that, like, you're suggesting, you know, the negotiations, whether they're labor negotiations or whether they're negotiations about how the program is built, are always about just reshuffling the deck. And you're suggesting, like, it's like the groundwork question that Lauren asked. It's like, are we actually willing to go back and actually think about how maybe it's not a 52-card deck, maybe it's a 58-card deck, or maybe there's different suits in the deck that we ever imagined. It's like, those are conversations none of us are equipped to have. It's why we need, like, outside voices coming in to open up our eyes in a way, and like that's, I think, such a healthy thing in the field now that we're willing to do that. But that's the kind of place I'm hoping we can get to, and I hope we don't let sort of our just our past conventions. You know, at an earlier conversation about composition, they were talking about how they were saying we want creative new composition. A grant program said that, but you had to use all the tools of traditional composition, as in, if your tools or methods of creating new forms of music were not the tools and methods that were approved, your contribution was invalid. And this is the same idea. It's like, those are the wrong tools and methods.
Yeah, appreciate that. Are you coming up?
Hi everybody, I'm the Sphinx Lead Engagement Liaison, and I am currently asking some questions from Hopin. One question came in from Rebecca Blum. It states, would it be beneficial to make the lessons optional or framed more as an opportunity to get audition prep feedback so that the fellow is seen more as a peer rather than a student?
Well, from the way I understand it, they are. Like, if you chose to never take a lesson with anyone, I think that would be okay. You know, that's your decision. But I don't necessarily think that is the solution to make it make you more of a colleague, because like I mentioned before, that is part of the draw, you know, to a fellowship. You know, no one applies, well, in my opinion, no one would apply to a fellowship with the idea like they've got everything all figured out and they don't need any help, right? So it's like, yeah, but that's not quite what we're saying, you know? It's like, yes, we're admitting that by applying, right? Yeah, we want a lesson, you know? Yeah, we want coachings, right? But I don't necessarily think that is the means to get into the solution of feeling more like a colleague, you know, just not taking lessons. Because you want to get better, right? So, I don't know.
You coming?
Hi, my name is Steve Wade. I'm the president of a thing called ROPA, which is Regional Orchestras Players Association. And we have 97 orchestras and about 6,000 players involved. And this is a group that is sort of the sister organization to ICSOM, which is 53 orchestras of higher budget size. And I just wanted to point out that the resources that might be in place for fellowships in ICSOM orchestras would be somewhat different from ROPA orchestras. ROPA orchestras are the kind of group where it's a much smaller budget. You might have players coming in from 3 or 4 different locals. One of my board members is actually in 6 different locals, hustles around the country and makes his living that way. First of all, Beth, I really want to congratulate you on actually pulling this off, because for us it's a difficult thing to negotiate, whether it's an MOU or whether it's part of the CBA. I'm curious, Lovrick, are you actually, when you became a fellow, did you join the AFM?
The AFM, did you say?
Right, yes.
Yes.
Okay, right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sure, yeah, so as such, he's part of the bargaining unit, and that means that not in your orchestra?
So he is a member of the union, but he's not a member of the bargaining unit.
Okay. Okay. All right, I'll think about that. What I was going to say as a kind of ancillary point is that I, as a orchestra committee or a negotiator, have a duty of fair representation to represent the interests of the fellows, as well as the players that have the 84 contracted players, for instance, in my orchestra. So I really am impressed that you actually managed to pull this off. It's it's not an easy thing to negotiate over, and really, the easier parts of it are actually the philosophical parts. The harder parts are the details, you know, who, what, when, where, why, how much money, all those details. And even as I looked at Sphinx's website for information on fellowships, the range of fellowships and what's actually offered, what's actually there for potential fellows, it's a huge range of possibilities there, even in just the 17 or 18 fellowships I looked at. So anyway, I just wanted to make that comment that in dealing with the bigger budget orchestras, there's a structure in place for the salaried players that might make it considerably easier to work in a fellowship than in a ROPA orchestra that is a much more, on the face of it, kind of a haphazard structure, if you will. And for us, for instance, it might raise issues of if you're funding a fellowship with grant money, for instance, what happens if the grant goes away? It raises all kinds of, you know, what ifs that might not be there for the larger budget orchestras. Thank you.
Yeah, and certainly there are a wide range of fellowships, and each orchestra's fellowship has different details. And you know, we're speaking here specifically about the Minnesota Orchestra Fellowship, so that is certainly true that they are all different. Many of them have some same elements, of course, but.
I mean, I think one of the questions to the prior, one of the things that at least we've just talked about, and I don't know if this would be something that the league, you know, could eventually look at when we look at what comes out of the whole ideas of this experience is, you know, and is this more scarcity if you were to say, well, maybe rather than fellows, just, again, have these clear positions that are demarcated, and there'd be 2-year positions, maybe 1 year, and this is just me, just riffing on my own with absolutely no authority, but like, would that be a better framework? That just that you rather than raise resources to say these positions are for that, rather than a fellowship framework, which is, you know, is going to have some element of that, or should you have both of them? You know, should that be the thing if we're just talking? But I'm curious what anybody thinks about that, like. Because I'm not inside the sector, so I don't know whether that would have all kinds of potentially other kinds of negative consequences. I wonder. I'll start with you, Lovrick. But
Yeah, that's a good question. See, because I think that would sort of change the. I think it would create a level of complexity for whoever is coming to fill those shoes. Because if you say that this is not a fellowship, but you're still only here because you're a person of color, but at the same time, we're going to make you equal to everyone else. Like, that sounds great, like, in theory, right? Like, okay. But at the same time, you're going to be that person that has to walk that and navigate that, because I like it, but not everyone will. But you will be the one that has to bear the burden of that, not anyone else. So, you know, I think things like that, like, are a good idea in theory, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people, you know, if I seen something like that pop up, like, you know, I might apply too. But you know, I do think it would be tough to navigate for sure.
if you ever thought, Beth, about even other ideas about how that, under what context maybe that could work, what would have to happen, any other?
Well, I have wondered about the same thing. Is like there still is that burden, you know. So I also, when you were asking that, what I started thinking about, Justin, was another conversation we've had about like the idea of a fellowship, and maybe there's some negative, the charity connotations of that. And so we had talked about, you know, is there a way to have it be an award? You know, like when you think about the Fulbright Fellowship, ooh, I have a Fulbright, you know? So is there a way to have it be an award and then it isn't a charity framework, you know? And I think that's something that you guys talked about in that group interview. So it's just something to noodle around on as well. Not an answer yet, but an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. Were you about to jump in, Lovrick?
Well, I just had a thought pop in my head that, you know, I don't not look at the fellowship as like an award. Like, it's not something else in my mind. You know, so that is interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to say that, you know, like.
Well, one of the things in the conversation was that people were saying it's a little bit dicey sometimes to explain it to someone. And so just an award is shorthand. It'd be like, I have an award. Oh, I get an award. It was really more, I think you all were saying, it'd be more legible. Yeah. That the term fellowship makes someone go like, oh, are you an intern or are you a student? But an award would just make it quicker to get it across, which is really more, I think, what you all are talking about. Yeah.
Another question from Hopin just came in from Anonymous. It states, what do you think about orchestras that create diversity fellowships, but sometimes do not hire/give it to anyone?
What about people who offer diversity fellowships? I guess it looks like they've got them, but then they're not actually given away.
Oh, so they have like the audition, but they don't actually place someone in it?
Yeah, it's like a no hire, you know.
Is that happening a lot?
Recently at Atlanta Symphony, I would say, from a personal friend told me that he went to an audition for the fellowship, and none of them were called, but mysteriously somebody was placed. But actually, it was way after when they were supposed to be placed and working.
What do you think about that, Lovrick?
Well, I don't work in that organization, so I have no idea about that, so I won't speak on that. But, you know, I don't know, because it's so complicated just to have a normal audition. And there are no hires in normal auditions as well. So it's kind of hard to, you know, of course I could have thoughts and I could come up with something, but I don't really know. You know, there's so many different variables that probably go into that. You know, if there were, you know, people that were qualified, but, you know, someone didn't, you know, that wasn't their personal taste of what, you know, they wanted in their section, you know, then it's like, all right, well, like, what can you do? But I don't know. That's interesting because, you know, there are no hires all the time. So I guess I don't look at it any different necessarily because it's a fellowship audition. But
hello, I'm Torrance Button, a percussionist at Southern Methodist University. I had a question. So I know we're talking about fellowships, but I did research about just being a person of color in orchestras, and a big thing about being a person of color is like culture and tradition. And I was wondering, what are some things that you guys are putting in place as far as the works you guys are programming outside of just developing the diversity of the orchestra and also the audience members too. So I think that's also a good question to ask and feeling welcoming into an orchestra as a person of color.
Yeah, so that's something that the Minnesota Orchestra is also very focused on, is what we're programming, so what composers we're programming, and also what guest artists, soloists, and conductors are on our stage, and that's a specific point of our strategic plan. And another one of the learning projects that we developed with Justin's leadership or consulting help, is a learning project about that has turned into the listening project. And if you stop by our table outside of the Renaissance Ballroom, the main ballroom. We have a lot of information about it, but basically it's about becoming more familiar with specifically Black composers, and also creating recordings of previously unrecorded works and making them freely available, specifically for artistic administrators to be useful in making programming decisions, to be of use to composers or composers' estates, because it is difficult when there aren't recordings for people to make decisions about programming. So this is something specifically that we're doing through this listening project. And so we have some information there at our table about that.
And I think also related to your question, one of the things that came up in the conversation with the fellows was around that there are maybe some who'd be interested in programming roles. That maybe if it was diversified as a position, right? That maybe it was thought of like as a thought partner or something like that. So that came up too, and sometimes fellows are engaged in that ways, but it's rather episodic. So it's like maybe that could be designed in.
Yeah, and I keep going back to that first meeting, but Alex told me at that meeting, he said, each fellow is going to be different, and some are going to want to engage in some of this, and some aren't. So I think that's, of course, every person is different. And so some people are going to want to engage in some of the programming,
just to give the
some
option.
not. Yeah.
But to another shout out to Alex, I don't know, I can't remember, but I feel like that whole initial design of the listening project, you were in those conversations as well, if you didn't even just give the idea to me, so, yeah, good. Okay, so, any other, yeah, please.
Hi, thank you for this conversation. I just have a question. Justin, you've mentioned reparations several times throughout this conversation. Can you clarify what exactly do you mean by reparations? How would that work?
Yeah, so I feel like there's a guy who's written a book, Olufemi Taiwo, and it's about reconsidering reparations. The UN has like 5 different ways they can come off. They can be compensation, they can be satisfaction, which are apologies, they can be, there's a few different ways, right? But I think that even, and this is something we talked about, I think you'd have to do it field-wide, right? So you'd have to say, for example, and this is why I appreciate what Garrett brought up in the very beginning around the meta frame of orchestras and where they were inside of, right? Even just doing a little bit of research about how the term the arts emerged, right? Like, these things have been put together in a certain kind of way. At one point, you might have put music with math, but now it's music with theater and dance, and it has a whole thing about aesthetics. I think you could make an argument that, like, the construction of the arts and the idea of aesthetics has caused incredible harm and damage. And the notion that certain people could perceive the ethereal, could perceive beauty, and could create it, and others couldn't. And if you look, I worked in a foundation for 10 years, and I always thought, that comment is basically the underlying principle of this budget. This budget gives money every year to these 5 organizations that basically follow the little I get of Kant and aesthetics. It looks like he advised them. And if you look at when other folks could start to get resources, it came later. I think that you could make an argument that, let's say, philanthropy, who's built the framework for this, would have reparations to the consequence to artists of color, communities. It'd have to be a conversation, but it seems to me until you go up on the meta level of this, it's gonna be a lot of tinkering, and I think that's why Lovrick's like, well, we can do this and we can do that, but like, as long as I walk around with like, I think for me, just the being hired at a foundation, it was still that notion of like, was this affirmative action hire? Because they had a rule. One of the last 3 candidates had to be a person of color, right? So I knew that. Now for me, I didn't care, right? I didn't care, but it did carry a little bit of weight with that. So for me, that's the kind of thing that a larger reparatory frame to me might make me put my chest up a little bit about like, yeah, I'm here because of this bigger picture, which we've all agreed to. And we know that you're here kind of because of this other bigger picture, right? That to me would give me a little bit more leverage. That's what I mean. So for me, what I'm saying is I think you have to put that on the table and have conversations about that. But it's more saying I think that it's legitimate as a conversation point. Does that answer?
A
A little? Yeah, because here's what I'm saying. Go ahead, please.
No, I mean, it's really about the mechanics of that. I mean, these are wonderful frames, but you have to execute on the frame in order for it to be effective. So how would an orchestra execute on making reparations to musicians?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, what's that? Oh, yeah. So how would an orchestra execute on that, right? I mean, I think, let's say that at the micro level, what would it be to say that these positions are going to be for BIPOC musicians? These we're taking 2 positions. Every single non-filled seat for the next 20 years is going to go like this. That is going to be our reparatory stance that we're taking, and we're going to hold that in this community. And we know we're going to catch some flack, but that's our position, and we can support it. We've done the research on why we're doing that, but to me, that would be a very here. The thing that I think would help is if you had an organization like the League say it, then it would give cover. But I think you could do that. That would be a practical example of that. Is that clearer? Is that better? Yeah. Okay. Done.
Hi, I just have one quick question. What vision or plan do you have for the future of this fellowship program at the Minnesota Orchestra?
The plan for the future of the fellowship? Well, there's an ad coming out on February 1st for the next audition, which is on May 8th, sometime in May. So we will have an audition for 2 positions. And Lovrick and our other fellow, Esther, are at the end of their 2-year stint. So that ad is coming out, and we are working on, are there some changes to make in the short term, and what are the changes in the long term? As we've been talking about it, the short-term changes that we're looking at are more in that DEI, inclusion agency realm, and the long-term changes are really looking at what is on the continuum along anti-racism.
I think we're about to wrap up and stuff, so we have some kind of like last thoughts. So we have one more question? Okay.
No, I want to go back to what she asked, and you sort of kind of answered, and she said she kind of understood it. So let's go back to that right quick. That sounds great, but what about those who are donors, the people who are at the level that's putting the money into place? What are their thoughts? Because I think that's where a lot of the issue lies. Are the people who are actually putting up the money for the fellowship, for that person who's supposed to sit in that seat. So those probably should be the people that should be here answering that question.
I'm going to push back on that a little bit. So I think partly what has to happen, I think that's important, for sure. Let me not push back. I agree that's good. Well, I have a thought, but let me see if Lovrick or Beth have a thought, because I've already talked enough about this. Go ahead, okay. So I think one thing is, I think we have to have a public conversation about reparations and bring it up very frequently, all the time, and make it like this is good public policy. So that's why I say that. I think that's what leads to those kinds of changes, is it becomes a more and more reasonable option. But I agree with you, though, that's why I kind of started with foundations, because I think you're right. I mean, it would clearly, and folks from the Minnesota Orchestra will be the ones who can speak about the details of that, because it would obviously have to include the people who pay for positions. I agree, yeah. Thought about
that? In terms of your whole plan of the restorative plan across the field? I don't have anything more to add to that at the moment, but I would love to be part of those broader conversations. I think that would be great conversations to have, yeah.
So we'll wrap up. You have a thought, Lovrick, you want to just kind of do just closing thoughts?
Yeah, that was just interesting to witness that. No, I mean, because like I understand where the question is coming from. You know, like there are a lot of things, you know, and a lot of good ideas get brought up, but it's like, okay, how do we do that? You know, because there are so many other different variables and so many other things working, and so it's like, you know, to say that this is the issue, you have to like go to like 10 other different things before you can actually get to that issue. But anyways, yeah, you know, that's sort of my general thoughts on that. But
Any wrap-up thoughts?
yeah, you know, I kind of, you know, like this conversation is sort of, to me, centered around, you know, a lot of like fixing and kind of going through like things and like, you know, this is what needs to be fixed. But, you know, the question earlier about someone asked if you make the lessons optional, like would it make the, you know, relationship between the fellow and the musicians, you know, that of more like a colleague feel than like a student to teacher relationship? And just sort of that question just in my brain made me think, you know, like, sure, there are these weird things to navigate in a fellowship, but I also want to point out, you know, like, if you do away with a certain part of a fellowship because it, you know, it's uncomfortable or whatever, I think you really miss the point. You know, even the conversation that we're having, you know, like these are difficult conversations. You know, anytime race comes up, it's like, you know. But I think it's important that you just don't say, okay, we're just not going to worry about that, and then, you know, let's try to make you the most comfortable. Because, yeah, that's really thoughtful, but, you know, like, my black skin isn't going anywhere, so, like, I'm going to have to figure it out at some point. You know, I'm going to have to navigate this. So, you know, so I guess kind of my point is, you know, I don't necessarily think that the things that we brought up are like bad, you know, like those things now make fellowships bad, you know. I don't know. Like I was saying earlier, like I never thought as the fellowship to not be an award. And sure, I kind of, you know, I remembered that conversation after. But, you know, I think fellows should be proud and, you know, feel like, okay, wow, you know, this is like a good, positive thing that I'm doing. And just like anything else, you know, you kind of like use what you can from it that's positive and take that with you, and what's not, you leave the rest, you know. But, yeah, I won't keep rambling.
Those are good closing words. Yeah, I was thinking. I went to the session of about the Black Opera Alliance, and there was a question about like focusing on the canon, and the one of the responses was about everyday experiences of Black artists and agency, and that's what I've been thinking about, and something we've been talking about, just the priority of the everyday experience and agency, and that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation. I'll go back to that time, you know, here in 2018 as well, because even the idea of the empty slots of seats, that's from my brother. So all of this, I sit here because my brother is here. I appreciate just seeing here in the audience, essentially. And it's been great to actually be able to have that opportunity that was introduced 4 years ago and to work with you all during this time. So just appreciate the chance to talk to you and to hear from Lovrick as well. So good night. Thanks, everybody.